Naruto, Dragon Ball, Inuyasha. A lot of you probably have heard these names. A lot of you know what they are. They're animes. Have many of you seen them? Some of you probably have. Now, what I'm going to be talking about is animes. And why you should be listening is because a lot of people in this world have looked down on anime. And it's for a lot of reasons that are understandable but arguable. So you should listen to me because I'm going to be explaining why you shouldn't look down on it, why you should give it a chance. The first thing I'm going to be talking about is going to be the origins, where it came from. The second thing I'm going to be talking about is where it went from that origins. And the third thing I'm going to be talking about is how it began to influence the rest of the world and how it started to integrate into modern society and change things around here. Now, for the first part, the origins. It didn't start off as just becoming, it didn't go right away and become Japanese cartoons, anime. No. First it started off as regular cartoons. A bunch of Japanese animators went to France and Germany and areas over there where they were doing regular, what's called Western cartoons. And from there, they started learning how to do what they were doing there, how to animate like them. And they liked it, but they wanted to change it a little bit. And then later on, as the years went on and they kept animating and making short little things, they came into what were called talkies. If any of you know anything about films, film didn't start off immediately with audio. It started off as silent, with maybe music in the background, if anything. So once film introduced audio talking, where you could actually hear the vocals of the actors and all that whatnot, it went into cartoons eventually a few years later. Now, from there it also went into a few years later when World War II happened. In World War II, the Americans and other countries like France and Britain were creating cartoons, and all of you probably have seen this if you've taken a history class and about World War II, that there were cartoons like Mickey and the Disney cartoons and all those other ones that were used as propaganda for the war to influence people to support it. And in turn, the Japanese made their own. And that's where they made their first Japanese animes. And these were anime films that were used for propaganda to help support their side of the war. And from there, that's where it began to become their own thing, more into Japanese cartoons rather than into Western cartoons. And so second, I go into my talk about where did it go from there? Well, after World War II, it was no longer needed to be about propaganda. So they started going back into a world there was more entertainment. It was more for satisfying the interest of the people. And so it went more for being, so the Japanese wanted to create their own sort of genre. And they created a genre that influenced a lot of things that come out in the future. The genre mecha, or as in everywhere else known, well actually in Japan it's known as super robots. And from there came like the animes probably heard of as what was it? Gundams, I believe it was. Yeah. And then later, a few years later, it would go on to make other stuff like it influenced the creation of Transformers, as a lot of you know what that is, obviously. And it also came out to the recent anime that was hitting up was Gurren Lagann. And from there, in the 1980s, that's when the big boom happened with anime. That's where the production started picking up. And the reason for this was it wasn't until 1980s that anime was accepted into the mainstream of Japan. All the years before, it wasn't accepted. It was just sort of a thing that kind of happened, but it never was, allowed to be out all over the place, and everybody wasn't exactly embracing it that much. But in 1980s, that's when it happened. And because of that, that's when it started to influence the cultures and started to become something more than just a little sort of cartoons that kids would watch. And so then that's where I go into where it began to influence the rest of the world. How did it start to change and just leave Japan from just being Japan's own little cartoons to influencing the rest of the world? Well, a lot of animators, like in America, like the ones that created a lot of Disney cartoons, such as, I believe it was Beauty and the Beast, The Little Mermaid, stuff like that. The animators of those were influenced by Japanese animators that made anime to make other stuff in similar style. If you look at a lot of, you've probably seen the cartoons for like Batman or The Amazing Spider-Man. If you look at the old comics, the way they looked in there, and you look at the animation style, they don't look exactly the same. They look a little different. If you compare it, the animations of the superheroes looks a little bit like anime. These aren't animes, they're American cartoons or Western cartoons, but their style is influenced by the Japanese style of anime. And so then from there, it began to influence all the other stuff too. And it didn't just influence like America or this side of the world, but also still influenced like Europe, where France, an animator over there, made a cartoon that was probably heard of if you ever watched Cartoon Network as a kid, Code Lyoko, if any of you have heard that. That is not an anime, but it is a Western cartoon styled as anime. And so from there, it continued to influence to the rest of the world. And one of the big things that came out of anime and the Japanese influence of it was conventions. And I'm not talking about like car conventions or whatnot, automobiles and stuff whatnot. I'm talking about like the type of conventions that you would cosplay and dress up to go. Anime influenced people to start to want to put these together, and these were fan service ideas. And from this, that's when people began to follow through, and these big conventions started happening. And it didn't just start, it didn't only make it so that only anime cosplay stuff, it started influencing conventions where it was like as well for video games or for YouTubers and whatnot and movies. And so from there it went on and it began to influence the rest of the world. Now, to conclude, the reason I gave this speech was so that way a lot of you can understand where anime came from. A lot of you have seen stuff that were influenced by anime, but for some reason you have rejected anime because of whatever the world rejects it for. I know a lot of the reasons are, and I don't need to name them. You probably all know them. But the rest of the world has been influenced, and a lot of things you embraced have come from anime's influences. So the reason I gave this speech was to help you understand and appreciate it. And so to conclude, the rest, yeah, that's it. I'm done. Yeah.